Good morning and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And I'm delighted to open today's event, U.S.-Cuba. And this is all about a new public survey that supports policy change toward Cuba with some quite fascinating findings. Today, the Adrienne Arche Latin America Center launches the key findings of the first national poll that centers solely on American attitudes toward U.S.-Cuban relations, conducted by the top bipartisan polling team of Paul Meslin and Glenn Bolger. The poll provides new insight into U.S. attitudes regarding individual strands of the Cuban embargo. You'll hear a lot more about that from the panel to follow. We're delighted to be partnering with Univision and with Fusion, the new multimedia platform created by ABC and Univision. And we're especially happy to have one of their star anchors, Enrique Acevedo, as our moderator today. So it's great to have you with us, Enrique. You may wonder why our new bipartisan Latin American Center, which has been established only since October, has decided to take on the third rail of U.S. foreign policy, or perhaps it's more the third rail of domestic policy, when current policies have largely remained in place for the past 5 decades. And there are really two answers to that. The first is we try to act in a bipartisan sense and in the U.S. National interest. And as U.S. demographics shift and new stakeholders enter the policy arena, we felt the time was ripe to examine the question of whether there was support for the notion that the U.S. should move in a new direction to achieve policy goals with regard to Cuba. But there's another larger issue, and that's the global context. The Atlantic Council believes we're in an inflection point in history, perhaps as important as the aftermath of World War I, the aftermath of World War II, and the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Tectonic plates are shifting. We've got the largest shift of political and economic influence since the 19th century, and it's unclear where the global system will land with what forces deciding what issues into the future. In this situation, we think the Atlantic Council has a special mission with its global allies and friends to shape the future, because if we don't, it may not go the way we want. We then take a look at issues that we think have a particular resonance at this historic turning point. And our Latin American friends, not friends from Cuba, but from all over Latin America, have been telling us that they believe that by unlocking U.S.-Cuban relationship, it could have major ripple effects across Latin America. And of course, our vision at the Atlantic Council is to have Latin America as a full partner in the Atlantic community with Europe and the United States. In that context, I think it's important that the European Union agreed to launch negotiations to expand relations with Havana yesterday. 2 weeks ago, the entire panoply of Latin American presidents joined the UN Secretary General and the OAS Secretary General in Havana at a regional summit which did not include the US or Canada. Former Florida Governor Charlie Crist this weekend changed his long-held opposition to normalization with Cuba. Former Florida Senator Bob Graham, long an opponent of normalization, visited the island for the first time last month. And various Latin American leaders are sending a message into the administration that the end of the Castro era is inevitable, and the U.S. has to think about how it wants to position itself for this moment. So we're giving this a lot of thought already. We certainly, at the Atlantic Council, are supporters of freedom in Cuba. We gave our Freedom Award 2 years ago to the ladies in white, the women, wives, relatives of jailed dissidents. So there's no doubt where we stand on that issue. I don't want to give away too much information before we turn to the pollsters on the poll, but let me just say that it shows that a majority of Americans on both sides of the aisle are ready for a wholesale policy shift, and even greater support is seen for incremental changes. The biggest aha moment in the report is that Floridians and Latinos are even more supportive than the nation at large. For years, the common wisdom sustained the Cuba issue was intractable because Florida's politics on the issue were intractable. I think we have to rethink that. We are joined today by a group of individuals who will provide expert interpretation and contextualize how polling results influence policy. Paul Maslin is a leading Democratic expert on public opinion research with a long list of national and statewide races under his belt. He's worked in every region of our country, and his company is based in California. Glenn Bolger is one of the Republican Party's leading political strategists and pollsters, so like the Atlantic Council, this is a bipartisan poll. He is a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies, a consulting firm that has dominated Republican consulting for years. We all know, and this will be in the panel after the senators, we all know CNN super analysts Paul Begala and Alex Castellanos from election night coverage. So this is going to be public survey poll morning coverage. And so we're looking forward to that. They bring long experience in working for and arguing for candidates and causes of their respective points of view. So I think that could get a little lively. We're also honored to welcome these two senators who, from different sides of the aisle, have long proven their wisdom and leadership to the American people. Both have visited Cuba and are outspoken on the subject of relations with the island. You can see an excellent op-ed in the Miami Herald this morning. Senator Patrick Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's always an honor to have you here, Senator Leahy, a senior-most member of the Appropriations Committee and of the Agriculture Committee. Important for all of us interested in foreign policy, you're also the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on the State Department, Foreign Operations, and related programs. Senator Jeff Flake, Republican of Arizona, serves on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Judiciary, Energy and Natural Resources, and the Special Committee on Aging. Prior to his Senate election, he served in the House of Representatives from 2001 to 2013. So thank you, gentlemen. We know how busy your schedules are. So without further ado, let me turn over to Peter Schechter, who has been running the Adrienne Arsh Latin American Center from October. It almost feels as though it's already been here for 10 years instead of a couple of months. But he's made a very big mark with his deputy, Jason, in a very short period of time. Congratulations, Peter. Over to you.
So as Fred said, there's a lot of things changing on the Cuba front. Things have been happening over the last couple of months. And one of the things that we noticed as a center was that the stakeholder that is perhaps the most important stakeholder of all hasn't been really talked about. This issue has been talked about in Miami, in Dade County, maybe a little bit in Broward County, and in Washington, D.C. But it was time to consult the most important stakeholder, which was the American people. That is what spurred us to do this poll. And I'm really pleased that both senators could join us this morning. So let me turn the program right over to Senator Leahy and invite you to come over and tell us, or wherever you feel comfortable. Why don't you speak there?
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And you mentioned the third rail. It's about time somebody touched that third rail, because political leaders of both parties have been oftentimes far too timid to do what's right for the United States. So I'm glad you invited me and my good friend Jeff Flake, the senator from Arizona, to be here. He's traveled to Cuba 9 times, Jeff, I believe you said, which is more than I have, but we traveled there together. The interesting thing, when we've gone there together, we can go there because you can't tell a member of Congress not to go. But that's not the case for most Americans. You can, Americans can go to any country they want except Cuba. Unless you're a Cuban American, you have to convince the Treasury Department you're entitled to a license. It can be costly and time-consuming. Some would call it a fool's errand. It's discriminatory, it's wrong, and that needs to change. So I'll thank the Atlantic Council, especially the Adrienne Arsh Latin American Center, for commissioning this extremely useful poll. Tim Reeser, who advises me on these things, and I were delighted when we saw the poll. We all know that you have something to do with Cuba, especially U.S. policy toward Cuba. then you can get a heated and emotional response from vocal minorities. Well, it can be intimidating because the silent majority sits quietly. I think of the time with Elian Gonzalez, when people say, oh, it's just terrible, we can send this child back to godless, lawless Cuba, and on and on and on, as they had press conference after press conference. I said it's a matter of whether you care for family values. Little boy sees his mother drown, he has a father who loves him. Any other country in the world would say we should be with his father. Thank goodness that's what finally happened. Greg Craig and others made that work. He got back with his father. He's done very, very well as a result. So I think we have to raise the voice of the American people. Thanks to the poll, they're silent no longer. And what we're hearing here is actually what I think we hear in Vermont, too, among people there. And I'm glad you did it in a nonpartisan or bipartisan way. People don't want to accept these facts or criticize the facts, but the facts are facts, and they're here. It's time to change course. It's time to modernize our Cuban policy. Can you imagine if Richard Nixon had been this timid toward China with far greater stakes, where we'd be today? Well, it's time to show the same kind of leadership. It's time to recognize U.S. policy towards Cuba, frozen in time for decades, has been unable to achieve any of its objectives. I can almost hear those advisors to Dwight David Eisenhower saying, Mr. President, hold tight, and those Castro brothers will be out of there in no time. Well, there's no disagreement among Americans on both sides of the issue. Of course, we should understand this, about the desire for a government in Cuba that respects individual liberties. Certainly a heck of a lot more than this one does. But the disagreement is how best can you achieve that without in any way withholding criticism of the way the Cuban government mistreats its own citizens, as well as an American, Alan Gross, who's been in prison there for more than 4 years. It's illogical to continue pursuing a policy that has absolutely no chance of success any more today than it did during President Eisenhower's time. About the only beneficiary of our embargo has been Cuba's current regime because they can blame anything they want on the United States. It's helped the Castros maintain control by using the U.S. as a convenient scapegoat. Now, change will come to Cuba as change comes everywhere. But current U.S. policy has delayed and impeded change. It is self-defeating. It's embarrassing. It is beneath the dignity of the greatest democracy in the world. The poll shows that a solid majority of Americans, including Cuban Americans, favor a different policy. Now, our policy should not be dictated by either the Cuban government or by a vocal minority in our own country who cling to a failed policy that's isolated the United States. Trade with Latin America, fastest growing part of our international commerce. But rather than isolate Cuba, we've isolated ourselves. Our Latin, European, Canadian friends engage with Cuba all the time. Our own companies, of course, are prohibited to. I remember one of my meetings with the Chamber of Commerce, talking about an oxymoron, in Havana, and they said, oh, these Europeans, Canadians, Mexicans, all these other countries say, we love your embargo. Keep your embargo. We don't want your competition. Well, it's not just money. It's how we treat other countries, how we show what America is. It's what the American people have made clear they want. Now it's the responsibility of the White House and the Congress to have the courage to step up. Let's end this Cold War in our own hemisphere. Thank you very much.
Senator Flake, please. Thank you very much.
I appreciate being here. I appreciate work of the Atlantic Council and for leading on this. This is great. Can't wait to hear all the results of the polls. You know, people often ask me, why are you involved in this issue? You're a Republican senator from Arizona. I've been asked that a lot when I first got elected to the House 13 years ago. I told people I took a poll among Cuban Americans in my district, and both of them said, move right ahead with this. We like what you're doing. But I introduced an amendment to the appropriation bill at that time to prohibit enforcement or money to enforce the travel ban. That's the only way we could get that legislation on the floor. I remember the first debate we had on the topic, one of the opponents to my position stood up and said, the gentleman from Arizona just wants to lift the travel ban so he can drink mojitos on the beach in Cuba. And the Democrat on the other side, Dave Obey, stood and demanded that his words be stricken, or his words be taken down in the House parlance, which you rarely see a Democrat do on behalf of a Republican or vice versa. And the person who made the comment apologized, and we moved on. But I went to Dave Obey afterwards, and I said, why did you do that? He said, hey, I know you're Mormon. I know you don't drink. I I'm just protecting your honor, he said. So anyway, but this has been a bipartisan position for quite a while, although I have to say I was called to the White House early on, and I was told that for the political reasons, and people, and I don't want to imply that the other side of this argument that there are no substantive reasons or anything else, but there are political reasons and have been all along, and I was told the reason we can't do this is F-L-O-R-I-D-A. And it was said like that. And that's why I think this poll is so important, because it takes away that reason. I think most of us have known in terms of policy and substance, there has been no justification for this travel ban or the embargo for a long, long time. You know, just last night, I was at a meeting with Secretary Kerry and John McCain to celebrate the 20th anniversary of our trade agreement and lifting of our trade embargo with Vietnam. Vietnam, country with whom we had our differences, and then some, where a war was fought. 20 years ago, we decided it was in our best interest to open up trade with Vietnam. Now, they're one of the TPP nations. Other negotiations are moving ahead. Why can't we move forward with Cuba? That's why I'm so appreciative of the work done by the Atlantic Council. And let me just say, it's been a treasure for me as one of the newest members of the Senate to work with Pat Leahy on this issue. He brings so much knowledge and gravitas to this issue. It's really been a pleasure to travel with him and to work with him on this. And so thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know both senators need to go back to the Hill, but would you indulge me for a couple of questions? Senator Leahy, given the roadblocks that you've talked about so eloquently for such a long time, how is change going to happen? I mean, is it going to come from Congress? Does it have to only come from the White House?
No, I think it has to come from both. You have members of Congress, both parties. I mean, you heard what Jeff was saying, who know that the time has come. I'd like the president to take stronger steps. There are a number of things that could be done by stroke of the pen, removing Cuba from the terrorist list. There are things that will be hotly fought by a minority in the House and the Senate. I think it has to be coordinated. I think this poll is a major step forward. But I think if it was placed to a vote among the American people, it would pass easily. And I think that's what we have to be responsive to. But I also think all the things that we find wrong with Cuba, and there are significant ones on restrictions of press and speech. I've mentioned the Alan Gross case. These things don't really get addressed unless we're willing to deal openly with them. And it is an anachronism that has no place in this century. And again, I use the thing, can you imagine if Richard Nixon had shown this timidity toward China, and I'm not considered one of the greatest fans of Richard Nixon.
Let me ask Senator Flake. I mean, you've said that our position on Cuba has created more misery for the Cubans and unnecessary restrictions for Americans. So, what does a sensible policy look like? What are the 2, 3, 4 first things that you would like to see come out of the United States?
Great question. I think, first of all, lift the travel ban.
God, yes.
Right now, the president has taken some measures to expand some of the categories for travel. Cuban Americans can travel freely and do. I think last year, more than 400,000 did so. And they have improved the lives of ordinary Cubans. I don't think anybody can deny that with the investment that's gone on. And it has also made a difference in some of the economic reforms, and those can be overstated, certainly. The Cuban government, their concern is control, and it always has been. But the fact that there is contact and commerce and travel and investment by the Cuban American community has made it far more difficult for the government to reverse those changes that have been made. And so it has improved the lot of the Cuban people. And for that, I think we ought to be happy with that change and ought to expand it. It was mentioned Alan Gross. Alan Gross has been in prison for 4 years. We need to address that. I hope we can. It'll be easier to do so if we talk more, I believe, with the Cubans. And let me point out the things that Alan Gross was doing, making it easier for Cubans to know what's going on in the outside world. I think that certainly is a good cause, one that could be forwarded more easily and faster if Americans were just simply allowed to travel. All Americans, not just Cuban Americans, to travel. And so for many reasons, to improve the economy there for ordinary Cubans, and to expose Cubans to the outside world in a better way, we ought to allow travel. And then if it were up to me, I'd lift the entire embargo as well and allow free and unfettered trade.
I agree with that. And I'll say, just think about it. Assuming they let us in, American citizens can go to North Korea, can go to Iran, can go to Sudan, can go to all these other places that we worry about. You can't go easily to Cuba, a Caribbean island just off our coast. It makes no sense. Jeff mentioned the event last night with the Vietnamese. I was there, and I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing John McCain and John Kerry, both of whom fought in Vietnam. John McCain, who suffered horrendously in Vietnam. They're applauding our trade relationships with them. And we use the Leahy War Victims Fund in Vietnam. We do all these things with them. I'll be visiting there in, was it Tim, April. And, you know, it just makes no sense. It's Alice in Wonderland. We are going to take some steps. We do want to get Alan Gross back. I've visited him twice now in prison. I correspond with him all the time. We talk with him all the time. That is a stumbling block. But let us go forward. I mean, it just, it makes no sense whatsoever.
I promised I wouldn't keep you here past a certain hour. Thank you both very much for coming by, and thank you both for your support.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Paul Maslin, and I will briefly describe, we can go to the slide that talks about the methodology of the survey that we just completed, Glenn and I, and then we'll sort of, since we've been talking about China and Nixon, Glenn and I will be the ping pong team here and go back and forth on the key results. In terms of methodology, we came at this from a number of directions. We did a national random digit dial survey among adult Americans. There is over 1,000, and it's weighted appropriately by geography and ethnicity, age, et cetera. We have a subcomponent of that, which are people that are registered voters. And just one note, because some people raised that issue last night on various media, the support level for changing the policy in Cuba actually rises by about 1.5 points if you just look at voters. So it's actually a bit stronger even there. We then did subsamples in Florida, in New Jersey, and among Latinos, and then sort of midstream, we decided to load up in both Florida, where we have over 600 interviews, so a margin of error plus or minus 4 points of Floridians, and then also in the national Hispanic sample. A typical national survey these days, you may get 100, 125 Hispanics at most. We have over 500 interviews among Latinos nationally, taken from high propensity areas of the country that we sampled in order to get the appropriate Latino population. So that's a sense of the methodology, and then we'll go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Glenn to start us off.
And just to clarify, Paul, you probably know the exact number, but approximately 2,000 interviews were done.
Total.
You had the national survey, and then you had the oversamples of the others. So I don't want people getting confused and thinking that the 1,000 was what we took the 500 and some odd from among Hispanic Latino voters. Well, we found the mood of the country is negative. 36% say the country's going in the right direction. 56% say it's pretty seriously off on the wrong track. That's a mood for change. Very similar numbers in Florida. The Hispanic Latino sample, more optimistic. 45% saying right direction, 40% wrong track.
Okay. The next slide. The only question we asked before we got to the critical question about normalization or engaging more directly a change in policy is we wanted to get a sense of how the American people viewed U.S. relations with Cuba. So in a series of 5 countries, we asked them on a 1 to 7 scale, basically, how close is the United States in terms of their relations right now with these countries? And as you can see on this slide, Cuba is viewed as we're having a worse relation with Cuba than even Iran, with a mean score of 2.1 on the scale, no different really in Florida or among Hispanics nationally. So the American people correctly realize that there's almost no relationship here. And then you can see as you go up the continuum here, you go to Vietnam and then Mexico and then England, where there is a correct view that we have a very close relationship. So that's the only question we asked before we then got to the question about changing policy. Next slide, and go back to Glenn.
Okay, keep going on the slides.
There you go.
And then when we asked people whether they favor or oppose changing the Cuba policy, and we split sampled it, but when you combine the 2 samples, and we'll get to that on the next slide, but when you split sample it, when you combine it, 56% favor changing the our policy towards Cuba, 35% oppose it, and you can see intensity, which is very important in polling, more strongly favor it at 30% than strongly oppose it at 22%. And I'm gonna take this next one and then give it back to you. Go on to the next slide, please. Thanks. We split sampled it where we asked half the people whether they favor or oppose normalizing U.S. relations with Cuba, and we asked the other half, do you favor or oppose engaging more directly with Cuba? You can see normalizing with stronger language, 60% favor, 33% oppose, whereas engaging was 52% favor, 37% oppose. Still majority in either case.
Okay, go on to the next slide. In Florida, as you can see, the support level is even stronger. We're well over 60% in Florida. Again, the intensity number overwhelmingly tilted toward the support. And then also among Latinos, Hispanics nationally, also over 60% support for this policy. And actually, the way the split sample worked in Florida, the engaging more directly actually was a little bit stronger there, not within the margin of error, but actually a little bit stronger than normalizing. And a lot of, I think, the Florida data is interesting because, and Alex and Paul will talk about this later, this is a state obviously tilted as you get more to South Florida. And support level in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County was 64%. The only place in Florida where the number dipped under 60 was in the Panhandle, which is anybody who knows Florida. The Panhandle is actually the southern part of Florida, in quotes, even though it is the most northerly, but more like the rest of the South than the rest of Florida. But it's a state that knows this issue, has dealt with this issue, talks about this issue, is obviously better informed than any other state in the U.S. As to U.S. relations toward Cuba, and here we have over 60% support.
The gender gap that we found might surprise people because we found men more supportive than women about changing policy towards Cuba. 61% of men, 32% opposed. Women, 51 favor, 38% opposed. Now, my totally unscientific view is this is because men are optimistic about two things. One is being able to buy Cuban cigars, and the other is more Cuban baseball players in the bigs.
I'll leave that commentary. And here's another fascinating piece of data. A lot of times we think about change and we think that young people will support it and old people won't. Well, we did find that Americans under 40 do support a policy change in Cuba. The numbers are almost 60%. But you can see that the support is as strong, in fact, a point stronger among Americans over the age of 65, with support level at 65%. As you go to 65 to 74 and 75 plus. And I'll simply observe, as somebody who's getting, unfortunately, too close to those categories now, that if you're 65 or 70, let's say, how old were you at various junctures in the past, okay? And you were 20 when the Beatles came to America. But you were only 18, 17, 16. You were coming of age when there was a missile crisis, or the Bay of Pigs, or even Fidel Castro taking power originally and fall of the Batista government. You have seen the saga of Cuba, and then the various junctures along the way with Mariel and Elian Gonzalez, et cetera. But I think my own feeling is that older Americans essentially have seen this for 50 plus years, and they're essentially shrugging their shoulders and saying, why couldn't we change? Why not change? Whatever we've done doesn't seem to have had much impact. You know, isn't it time to make this difference? It's one of the rare cases that you see older folks actually strong or stronger supporting a change in policy as younger or middle-aged Americans.
I think this slide is the most important one in the whole presentation, and that shows that a majority across political parties favor changing our policy towards Cuba. You see it's a little bit lower with Republicans, but even then it's 52% favor. 60% among independents, 60% among Democrats. There are very few issues in this country today where you see just an 8-point difference in support between Democrats and Republicans, and Alex and Paul prove that every time they're on together on CNN. So, but I think that's fairly dramatic. And going to the point that Paul Maslin made a little during the methodology, the people who are not registered, we surveyed adults, but the people who are not registered are less supportive. So the people who are registered to vote are even more supportive overall than the overall sample.
The same pattern in Florida, too, where a majority of Republicans and self-identified conservatives, a majority of self-identified conservatives in Florida support a change in the policy toward Cuba. You can see just a quick add-on to what Glenn said. Liberal Democrats are the strongest in this group, but you can see that moderate liberal Republicans are also over 60%. Even conservative Republicans, dead split, 48, 46. Tea Party Republicans, there is opposition, but it's a bare majority, just 51%.
As education levels show, the higher educated Americans are, the more likely they are to support a change in our policy. Even still, you have a plurality of those with a high school degree or less who support a change, 45%. Then it hits 58% with those who have some college education. College graduates at 60% and 67%, even higher. So again, when you look at it just kind of broken down between some college or less or college degree or more, it's still a majority of both.
And you see the gender gap, the same pattern. If you're a college-educated man, you're almost 70% support for a change in the policy. I'll take the next one, too. So then we went into specific areas of what a new policy could be. And just ask people flat out, do you support or oppose this? The strongest support is for something that actually is already going on. I don't think most of the American people know this, but actually is going on, which is there are discussions right now, meetings with the Cuban government coordinating issues of mutual concern like drug trafficking or smuggling. That's supported by over 3/4 of our sample, and in Florida at 82%. So almost overwhelming, almost unanimous support for the notion of have some kind of discussion and coordination with Cubans on mutual issues like drug trafficking or smuggling.
when you look at 4 additional potential changes, allowing more American companies to do business in Cuba, removing restrictions on U.S. citizens to spend dollars in Cuba, removing all restrictions on travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens, and I'll get to those 3 first, and I'll come to the last one in a moment. Notice that the support is pretty uniform across the board, 61, 62%, and opposition is 35, 36% for those 3 proposals, for those 3 ideas. And the intensity, 35% strongly support it. So you have as many people who strongly support it as total oppose it overall. The one that did not test quite as well, but still had a majority of support, is allowing Cuba access to high-speed internet and other telecommunication systems based in the United States.
Okay. And in Florida, you have the same pattern of strong support for these measures, 63% allowing American companies to do business, 63% on the travel restrictions, 67 on spending dollars, 67% on travel restrictions. There is an exception in Florida when it comes to the internet. And I think we were just talking about this yesterday. This is a classic case of my family's there, I know people, I'd like to be able to communicate with them back and forth, I'm sure, because in Florida, the question on the internet is supported by about the same level as on the other questions, 64%, which is significantly higher than the rest of the country to allow access to internet and high-speed telecommunications.
Moving on, and we then asked a series of factual statements about Cuba and asked how important it is to normalization or to further engagement. And the first one was Cuba is only 90 miles away from the U.S. mainland. 58% said that's a important fact for normalization or engagement. 35% say no, we should just keep the policy the way it is. And then our government allows only Cuban Americans to travel to Cuba without permission. Treasury Department must approve it. Again, very similar numbers. So you have majorities saying those 2 facts are strong reasons to support change in our Cuba policy.
Right. And then the additional in Florida, you can see again very similar results. And among Hispanics nationally, 58% on the 90 miles away, 61% on the for Hispanics, and again about 60% on the travel question, as well as these are important reasons or a reason to engage or normalize as opposed to keeping the current policy.
Then on the next page, the 2 that we asked, the second one on there is actually factually incorrect. It was written based on a misreading of a report, so kind of ignore that data because it doesn't mean anything. But we did test the impact of the trade embargo and the impact on the U.S. economy. And again, not quite as strong, but still 56% say yes, that's a good reason to normalize or engage.
And on to the next slide. Among Latinos, the whole question of $4.8 billion cost in terms of the embargo to the estimate to the U.S. economy, that result is over 60% for Hispanics nationally, 57% in Florida saying that's a reason to normalize.
We also tested 2 statements that were counter to kind of a pro-change message. The first one talking about the dismal human rights record and of the Castro regime and what they've done, and then the fact that after no relations, the Castro regime remains in power. And that did get a majority of people nationwide, a small majority, to say, yes, we should keep the policy the way it is. Still 43 to 41% on those 2 questions say, no, we should change policy. What we didn't, and you can see the numbers for Florida, fairly similar. Hispanics, different. They were more likely to say, no, we still need to change policy even with those 2 pieces of information. But what we did was later, you'll see that we re-asked do you favor or oppose changing policy or keeping things the way it is, or changing policy towards Cuba, I should say. And these 2 statements did not have a significant impact in terms of changing people's mind.
Okay. We raised the issue of these list of State Department list of state sponsors of terrorism. We found that nationally, 40% think that Cuba does pose the same threat of countries such as Iran, Syria, and Sudan. But in Florida, that number is significantly lower, only 31% who feel that way. And then we simply added one, we'll go to the next slide, I'll just continue this. We added one statement. We said there are thousands of al-Qaeda terrorists in Sudan or Syria, and Iran has been aggressively building a nuclear program. Despite human rights issues, Cuba poses none of these threats to America. Now, how do you feel about Cuba being the same threat and being on this list with these other countries? And you can see there's a fairly significant fall off. The 40% who said originally Cuba belongs on the list essentially drops to 30%. In Florida, it drops to 24%. So with one simple statement comparing the countries that are on that list to Cuba, we have a situation where it's essentially almost 3-to-1 of Floridians who say Cuba is not the same threat and in fact should not be on the state-sponsored list of terrorist nations.
We then tested a series of statements both for and against changing U.S. policy towards Cuba. And we asked respondents how convincing each of those messages are. And this shows the overall results in the first two columns, both for the intensity, the percentage very convincing, and the overall convincing, and then state of Florida and Hispanic, the Hispanic oversample.
And I should note here that we had split samples. Nobody heard more than 3 of these messages.
And that's an important point to add. You'll see that in a couple of minutes why. But the 5 messages, we summarized them by basically the first word in there: trade, hurting the people of Cuba, Vietnam, change, and Florida. And as you can see, basically the messages all tested very similar in terms of the intensity, mid to low 30s on trade, on it's hurt the people of Cuba, not the government. Today we have good diplomatic relations with Vietnam, as Senator Leahy pointed out. Then communism or dictatorships, Cuba's government will eventually change, so we're better off engaging. And then the last one did not test quite as strongly, and that is for too long politicians have allowed Florida to control U.S. foreign policy. It is time to set our Cuba policy based on what is best for America's overall national security and economic interests. Now, you still had even a majority in Florida saying that's a convincing statement. Intensity was a little low at 26%. But overall, the messages scored very well, particularly on trade in both Florida and among the Hispanic oversample.
And then we did one additional question about U.S. immigration law, that is currently preventing. We asked just of Latinos, essentially, sort of is there resentment that Cuban Americans are treated differently? They get instant citizenship, and other Latinos didn't. This did not produce an overwhelming response. It was pretty good, but not at the level of some of the other ones. But then we did switch to the negative, and people did hear at least 2 of these messages as well. And you can see that they have some impact. The very convincing numbers are a little bit lower than the positive statements. The first one essentially is saying that ending the embargo before the Cuban government meets conditions specified would weaken the United States, send a bad message out to the rest of the world, to places like Iran and North Korea. Then we talk about the next message, essentially the value of putting economic pressure on the regime, while at the same time Cuban Americans are able to travel and have more contact now with their family and brethren in Cuba. And then finally, essentially an argument says this isn't the time to do it. You got to stay tough. That's what we did with communism. Sort of that argument which you hear in general about this policy. These messages didn't do badly. They're not quite as effective as the positive messages. And then I'll turn it over to Glenn for the impact. We wanted to see at the end of the poll what happens to the fundamental number on support for normalization or engaging people directly. People now have heard a back and forth, which is what we in political surveys like to do because that's the real world. Simulate what might actually start to happen as you have a real debate and a real discussion about, and will we see support either grow, decline, does it move around a lot? What kind of impact does it have? And Glenn will.
And this is what we call in political polling the informed ballot. Okay, now that you've heard more about this, how do you feel? And you can see up on the left, as you look at the screen, the initial ballot, we talked about that much earlier in the survey, 56-35. After they've heard all the messages, the data has not changed significantly. 55% still favor, 39% oppose, so just a very small shift against. And by the way, it's much easier in campaigns, particularly issue campaigns as opposed to candidate campaigns, to beat something, to get people to say no, because change tends to be seen as risky and uncertain, and so for the number to basically go unchanged, when I work on the yes side in an initiative campaign, when we do this, after we test the negative messages and the positive messages, if the yes number is unchanged, that's usually a good sign. So again, we did not see a significant shift in opinion here.
And then finally in Florida, the numbers supporting the policy actually went up from 60. It's within the margin of error, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on, well, if you have a debate in Florida, you'll have, and Alex and Paul will get in the middle of this debate, and people will actually increase their support. But the fact is that in the poll, it does end up at the end of the day in the state of Florida, after a back and forth, at 66%, more than 2 to 1, supporting either a normalization or engaging more directly, but a change in U.S. policy toward Cuba. And among Hispanics nationally, the numbers at the end of the poll are holding essentially just over 60% support as well. Then we had one last question.
And that was, we first read the description, the United States often establishes a special diplomatic position called an envoy for countries that we have hostile or tense relationships with, like North Korea, Sudan, and the Congo. Would you support the U.S. sending a special envoy to Cuba? Using nationally, 2 to 1 support, 61-32. No difference in Florida. And then the Hispanic oversample, very similar at 59-33.
Wow. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for that presentation. Senator Leahy was saying that he found an aha moment in the poll. I would argue that the whole exercise is actually an aha moment. The results are amazing. And I want to start with you, Alex, because you were born in Havana, Cuba. And, you know, 52% of Republicans favor this normalization of relations. What do you think that is at this particular moment in time?
Oh, well, gee, that's a lot to chat about. First, let me say thanks for the opportunity to be here with my friend Peter, and finally to see the peripatetic man settle down, and the opportunity to discuss this, I think, in a balanced way. It's nice to see that arguments for and against were made there. Not everyone has the courage to do those kinds of things, so well done. The argument for opening up relations in Cuba, where does it stand with Republicans now? Let's see. In Cuba today, the law is whatever they say it is at that moment. So I guess in that sense, it's a lot like Obamacare. It's unpredictable.
I think that was a land speed record for getting Obamacare.
45 seconds. We just want to know here.
No, I'm impressed.
We got to have a little fun as you go.
I was wondering how you were going to get that into the whole discussion, but
I got to find a way to raise WMD now. I don't know how.
We can get into the substance here as we go along. But I'd say this, that Republicans, I think like everyone in this room, would love to see the argument on debated and elevated a little bit. What is the best way to bring freedom to a place that is 90 miles from our shore, to make it more productive? We've heard today from Fred and others so many arguments about the geopolitical opportunities and necessities that are out there. That is Cuba, you know, what's going to happen to Cuba post-Castro, and the impact on Latin America, the economic potential for the region. Is China going to end up moving into Cuba because we didn't? There are all kinds of arguments there. And I think a lot of Republicans feel, as I do, that perhaps the most corrosive and powerful weapon we have to bring change to a place like Cuba is freedom. I mean, freedom is relentless. It is corrosive. Blue jeans, the NBA, rap music. You know, a lot of that is what brought down the Berlin Wall. And I can see those arguments. And Republicans, you know, Senator Flake has a 100% conservative voting record. We're at a point today where I think we can debate those things. And then you start listening to some of the pro-democracy groups that are in Cuba now. Berta Soler, the ladies in white, whom you awarded last year, who says, no, not now. Keep the heat on. The largest pro-democracy group there, folks who risk their lives, and not only there, but their families' lives, to get out a message that says, no, not now. Keep the pressure on. When people who are in the cauldron with their families say, keep the heat on, even though we're still here, that's a pretty persuasive argument that you have to look those folks in the eye and say, it's time to open the doors. And I think what Republicans are most concerned about is this a Syria-like situation where you lengthen the stay, you delay change.
Right. But I mean,
So that's where I think the debate is among Republicans. Politically, I'd say this, and Paul, I think, might agree. You know, we've all had that candidate who gets great survey numbers, shows up, looks at you and says, look, if the election were held today, we'd win. Should you tell him or I tell him? The election's not being held today.
Right. It'd be very surprising if the election were held today, actually. It'd be a shock.
And if you run a campaign and you elevate those negatives and you make a TV spot that says they're here, risking their lives, their families, pro-democracy factors in Cuba.
but if
They're
not,
risking their lives in every day, and they say don't normalize relations. But candidate Fred Farkle does not care, does not listen. I would submit to you that that will give you more of what a real contest would look like.
right. But if not now, the question would be when, Paul. It's 16 laws, the embargo, around 16 laws, that have been in place for over half a century. And it's not working. We pretty much got that cleared out. So when?
Well, I mean, it's TikTok. This is a really important survey. And first, Peter, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be back with you. He and I have done projects together in the past. And Mr. Kemp, thank you for having me as well. And I don't speak, I saw Clemens and Greg Craig, people who really know Cuba. And they're like, what are you doing here? I don't know Cuba. But I know politics. I know American politics. And the politics on the issue of Cuba, but also of Cubanos, Cuban Americans, it's changing so fast, it's difficult, I think, for political strategists to wrap their mind around it. That's why this survey is so important. Okay, when older people are more open to change than younger people, this is the age cohort that most strongly supported Mitt Romney, not Barack Obama. They're more open to change. When men are more open to change than women, that's really unusual. This thing
just because old men like me can't remember anything.
No, I think they want the cigars too. I think Bolger's right that that's what they're looking for.
That's a powerful argument.
I have a friend who smokes them, and he says, I do it in protest. I take the Cuban national symbol and I light it on fire. So, but I think that when you dig even deeper, and I looked at some other data, 2002, which for us was not very long ago, right? For my kids, that was forever. But 2002, the partisan self-identification of Cuban American voters was 54 Republican, 14 Democrat. You know what it is today? 38 Democrat, 34 Republican. Holy smokes. Okay, that is a fast-moving train. Barack Obama won the Cuban vote. And he won Florida by 0.5%. It's the closest state in America.
Both times.
So both times. This last time, it was even closer. And he won it by 0.5 point. So it's still really a difficult issue. I think probably more in Alex's party, particularly with the Florida primary, that can, for the presidential, be very critical, very absolutely important. So there's a healthy dose of caution that I think he and I want to get into. But right now, what you just see is, polls are classically defined as a snapshot in time. Boy, this is an important snapshot, and you are catching a really fast-moving train.
Peter, I wanted to ask you about the region, about Latin America, because it was mentioned that just a couple of weeks ago, many Latin American leaders visited the island of Cuba, and you see this attitude of basically praising the Castro brothers and calling him comandante. In the case of Mexico, they actually, the foreign debt that Cuba has with Mexico, it was, I think, they forget about 70% of that. It's like $5 billion. But you see this attitude of not looking at what's going on with human rights and democracy and the lack of freedom of speech and conditions in Cuba, but just trying to take a picture with Castro. I don't think that's where you want to take things, the way things should be. Then the European Union is approaching Cuba with trade and investment, which is, it looks more favorable. What do you think in terms of Latin America?
I mean, I think that sometimes in foreign policy, and a couple of our speakers have mentioned this, sometimes in foreign policy you have some structural impediments. I mean, when we wanted to open to China, we had to accede to a one China policy. And there was a loser. Taiwan was a loser. When we wanted to have a much more aggressive and open foreign policy to Africa, we had to denounce apartheid. There was no ability to enter to talk about Africa without denouncing apartheid. And I think sort of the structural impediments in Latin America and for our relationship with Latin America really have two. One is immigration. We know this issue well, it's well debated here, but it's an issue which Latin Americans feel very deeply about. And the other one is Cuba. And what has happened after 55 years of trying to isolate Cuba and a policy of regime change is we're at this really counterintuitive moment in which Cuba is anything but isolated. As you've just said, the Europeans are about to open up to Cuba. The Latin Americans all go to take pictures of themselves in Cuba. Tourists from Canada, from Europe are sort of cascading into Cuba. There's 500,000 American tourists who visited Cuba last year. So you have, I mean, a country which is the idea of being embargoed or isolated is completely wrong. But the Castro government uses el bloqueo, the blockade, as its crutch. You know, if it is, even if it's not blocked off, even if all these Latin American countries are coming, it continues to harp over and over again about the blockade. And so you have to wonder have we come to a moment in which this very unusual thing has happened? America has been sidelined rather than the Cuban government. And so you have these meetings happening on a bilateral basis. Nobody consults any longer with the United States about what their foreign policy ought to be towards Cuba. And so you have a very unusual situation in which a policy for 55 years that has tried to sidelight Cuba has actually perhaps sidelined America.
Let's talk about executive orders and the possibility that President Obama acts on this unilaterally. Paul, do you think that that's an option?
Well, it's an option. He's done a lot already. He has, and I think the people in America who support change in Cuba probably haven't given our president enough credit for that. And there's so he's done that in terms of Cubans visiting, in terms of money going back. There's also the symbolic. I mean, we all remember the whole planet was watching the Mandela funeral, and our president went up,
the handshake,
and shook Castro. And my conservative friends, as Bill Clinton would say, squealed like a pig stuck under a gate. But, you know, the ground didn't open. Obama wasn't swallowed up into it. He wasn't struck by lightning. But you know what else didn't happen? Is that Castro didn't reciprocate. You notice the two senators who, on totally opposite sides of the political spectrum, who support this. Both of them mentioned, in very brief remarks for senators, human rights, Alan Gross. I really thought, I saw that and I thought, as a political strategist, right? Now, Raul's got to release Gross. I mean, right, that would be, so President Obama can do a lot, but the truth is Castro could do more. He could do a lot more to make it easy for us, for politicians, to come I mean, and first, he's holding an American, and it's an outrage, and I noticed the two strongest supporters of changing the policy went out of their way to talk about Alan Gross and his imprisonment. So it is a two-way street. The Cubans had to make it easier for Obama to move as well.
It's not in their best interest, as Peter was saying.
That's exactly right, Enrique.
But what about Congress? Any actions from Congress, Alex? You know, I mean, we see there's some sort of bipartisan support for this.
Congress is being so incredibly productive right now that I doubt I doubt this will be.
They don't have a minute to spend on
a minute to spare. Certainly not through 2014. But you know, I do think there's an opportunity on the other. Let's have this same meeting in Havana and take a step forward if the ladies in white could attend, if the largest pro-democracy Farinas' group there, if they could attend, why don't
should do a poll in Cuba.
Should do a poll. The ball is in their court, I think, right, as Paul noted as well. So if you want to engage with the world, and look, the blockade hasn't been effective. Nothing's changed in 50 years. Okay, that had some effect. Cuba is not now exactly the beacon of economic progress in Latin America. It certainly isn't what it could be. So I think it's, until politically right now, I don't think this is an issue that the Obama administration is interested in tackling. The Democratic Party is already seen as moving left of Clinton with Obama, and in Congress, foreign policy at all just right now is, I think, secondary to the economy.
But Alex, I think, speaking for the public and the people that we interviewed here, And yes, there's a 35% opposition throughout the poll. There's a 30% opposition in Florida. There's a 30% opposition in South Florida. But there's a 60% support level. I think the American people, if this debate were to start to sort of come out to them and kind of move into the national psyche, I don't think they're going to be moved. And I don't think in Florida, where people have the fullest information, and people went through this entire exercise of a poll, and obviously what we do in terms of communication and campaigns and with images and what you've done and what we've all worked on is different than simply a poll and talking to somebody over a telephone. But the fact is, we brought a lot of these messages up, and Floridians at the end of the poll was just as supportive, if not more supportive, than they were at the beginning. I think the American people can handle this debate, and I don't think the administration ought to be afraid of it.
Isn't it a mandate,
the one thing
in a way?
I'll certainly agree with. That to me, what this says is not necessarily that government is ready to compel any great change at this moment, because they're the most sensitive political survey and barometer that exist. But it certainly says that the American people are ready to engage in this debate. I think in a more civilized way than we have seen.
And that phrase that is used first, Mr. Kemp, and then Senator Leahy picked up on about the third rail.
Right.
It's just not anymore. It doesn't mean it's easy. You know, you're going to have to engage this if you want to win it. And there's always the risk when things poll like 2-to-1, you know, in favor, like gun control. It's 80-20 for a lot of these gun control proposals. Guess what? The 20 is only people who vote on it. And they will vote your ass out. So you got to be really careful if you're a politician. But in this case, it's clear that this is not a third rail any longer. And it has enormous saliency in that 30-35%. But as a strategist, I would tell a client, oh, you can survive this, you can win. If this is your authentic position, right? If you're where Flake is or where Leahy is, you can win this thing. Whereas even just 10 years ago, you wouldn't.
But that's the interesting part. Can you not only survive it, but can you win campaigning on this?
Now,
I mean, from a strategy standpoint and also
else,
from a poll standpoint, from a number standpoint.
Charlie Crist may be the guinea pig here.
Right.
But,
I think you'd have much more success advancing this cause if Charlie Crist opposed you, but that's
Charlie Crist, he'll lose for other reasons, maybe not on this issue, but this will be a minor point in the governor's race.
Peter, we have a great audience, and they've stayed all this time. Maybe we can get a couple of questions from the audience. If anybody wants to, sure, over here, and then we have a couple of questions. We still have time. Over here on the right. If you can just say your name and where you come from. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Graciela Hernandez. I'm an intern at the Canadian Embassy. I just had a question. So what do you consider to be the reasons and the factors as to why Americans have changed their attitude towards Cuba progressively? Do you think it's a historical process, a political process, or because, you know, Cold War ideologies aren't as strong today as they were, you know, 30 years ago? So I was just wondering why the change.
I think it's a couple of things. Look, the world is changing. Public opinion changes as well over time, and I think this is one of those issues that it's changing on, as Paul Begala pointed out, relatively rapidly. I think that people are of the more of the opinion that openness is better and more likely to cause change. And also, look, what we've done in the last 55 years or so has not worked in terms of changing Cuba. It may have had, as Alex pointed out, rightfully so, may have had certainly some impacts on it, but we have not succeeded in opening up Cuba, and maybe we ought to try something different. And that's why I think you see the older respondents in this survey in particular being more supportive, because let's say we've done something for 55 years, it hasn't worked, let's do something else.
And to Paul's point earlier, I don't think that the Cuban community as a whole has adapted yet, that we're getting older. And if there was kind of a seed crystal of opposition to opening relations with Cuba, we're getting older, we're getting smaller, like a pillar of salt, we're kind of withering away. A new generation is coming along that are not as less, from one point of view, as familiar, as emotionally involved in the issue. Guess what? The great American melting pot still works. By the time you get to the second generation, us Cubans are becoming you guys, you know? So Cubans begin to look much more like everybody else in public opinion surveys. The Cuban, quote, the Cuban vote, the Cuban leadership has not really come to grips with what happens a decade from now or two if they don't transmit their culture, if they don't come up with Plan B. And I think that's a part of the reason.
I just want to say to Alexander, it would almost seem like two aging parties are the ones that most want to keep it where it is. The aging parties in Havana and the aging parties in Miami.
Well, they remember, you know, for many of us, this is Hitler. And you're asking us, okay, for a lot of great geopolitical reasons, and we should sell stoves to Hitler. Let's do business.
What about the
Part
emotional
of me
reasons?
says that's a great idea because it's our most powerful weapon, freedom that we have. But that generation that still remembers, and I do, I'd love to have, my son is here, I'd love to have him see where I was born.
I was going to ask you that.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to, my wife has never seen it, daughter never has. I'd love to walk Varadero, the beach again, one more time, show these guys. A friend went not long ago on a church mission and sent back a picture of the home we used to live in. I didn't know I remembered these things. Oh, there's my bedroom. Oh, there's my parents' bedroom. So yes, I would love to see all of that, but not at the expense of someone who is there today fighting for, the people were arrested this past week going to church, pro-democracy demonstrators, not at the expense of their efforts. That I cannot do.
But just one more aspect to broaden it out to the American people. You know, we had 6 years ago, we had a debate between two Democratic presidential candidates in which one of them criticized the other for saying, I'll talk to anybody. Well, that other one became the Secretary of State. And now our policy is to try to negotiate with Iran, to try to talk to warring or competing parties in the Middle East, to have a world that, understanding its complexity and things that are, quote, democratic, as we see in the Arab Spring, don't always work out the way that people intended, but that there's a general feeling that this is a world where people communicate. And Cuba is 90 miles away, and we have so little communication. And I think at some fundamental level, American people haven't thought about this a lot. Cuba just shows up every now and then. Every 10 or 15 years, it pops onto the radar screen for some reason. But their general feeling after all this time, I think, is, it makes perfect sense. It's common sense. Why not? I think that's what Senator Leahy basically said. It makes no sense. And I think that's what's driving a lot of these attitudes.
We have a question over here.
They're a very well-behaved audience, don't you?
Everyone's very well-behaved.
Hey, Steve Clements with the Atlantic Monthly. I usually say the Atlantic, but I get confused for the Atlantic Council, and Fred gets complimented on what a great magazine he has. I was trying to imagine today's forum with two other senators here, Bob Menendez and John McCain, and how they might respond and what would be the issues. And it seems to me from a political perspective, just kind of raw politics, while I find that the data really compelling and interesting, I'm one that thinks that most of these foreign policy issues are negotiated in a way that are quite devoid from American public opinion. But I think what you've laid out is interesting. But when you come out to the just battles between personalities, Bob Menendez has burned up a lot of his political capital with this White House. He used to be given a lot of latitude on Cuba. There's no good feeling right now between them for a lot of reasons. John McCain, who is really also exactly where I think Alex has laid out, nonetheless is the leader on Vietnam, and whether it's John Negroponte or John McCain or others that have supported a change in that policy, certainly the exact same dynamics were in play when that liberalization process happened. If you were to go look at numbers and the resistance on normalization, even the criticism of McCain at the time, it was substantial. And so, and I would say there's respect for McCain, but it seems that the latitude that used to be given to those that were the anti-Castro, Cuba-obsessed crowd in the Senate, we won't get to the House, that they don't have the latitude that they once did with the White House. So one question is, given the fact that I don't think the American public cares or that this isn't high on their priority, but doesn't mean they're going to get in the way, isn't there a play where the White House just says, screw you, Bob Menendez, we're going to move on this?
Good question for a Democrat.
I mean, that's never a good strategy to tell the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that, you don't like him. And they have, obviously, Steve, you've covered it, they've butt heads on a number of things. And you have to, listen to what Alex just said, you have to be respectful. You can't, this is not a 100-0 thing, and it's not an easy thing. It's actually good news politically that it's not as salient as it used to be. That's kind of all you need if you want to change the policy, is to just to sort of calm everything down. But I think situating it in a larger context really does help. I'm still struck by just 10 years, this enormous change in the Cuban-American vote. There's probably a lot of reasons, some of it cohort replacement, some of it, but you know, on this question of engagement that Paul raised from the 2008 campaign, the biggest thing that's happened is the Iraq War. And the lasting contribution of George W. Bush's greatest debacle is perhaps discrediting bellicosity and belligerence. This used to not be a country that would want to like sit down with Iran or sit down with Cuba or sit down, and the disaster of Iraq, and I do think it'll take 50 to 100 years to really work through the disaster of that policy. But at least if you want to find one like silver lining, it's that Americans, they didn't even like the president, this president, Mr. Nobel Peace Prize winner, they didn't want him bombing Syria. The American people were dead set against his very bellicose or muscular, I'm going to call it, policy to Syria. We do not want any more wars in this country, and maybe that's part of what's moving this too.
Just real briefly, may I add that we're a long way from the day where communism was an intellectual threat. That has collapsed. The idea that big, dumb, slow, centralized, collectivist control of a dynamic, interconnected society, that it can manage that, no one believes that anymore, especially not American bobsledders. They can't make anything work over there. The point of it is, they don't see, I don't think the world sees communism at this point as the threat that we saw it in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s through the Reagan years, at least intellectually. You know, now there's a new, more virulent global enemy, and so with that, I don't think Cuba is seen as that threatening beachhead to the United States.
I was watching an interview with Edward Murrow did with Castro about, I guess, 50 years ago. It's on YouTube if you want to watch it. And at some point, Murrow asks Castro about his beard. He says, so are you going to shave your beard now that the revolution is over? And you know, what's going to happen with the beard? And Castro says, well, I'll shave the beard when I fulfill the promise of bringing democracy to my people. He keeps the beard. So maybe we need a president in Congress that says, Mr. President or Commander, shave your beard. That, I want to thank everyone in the panel for your marvelous work on the poll and the discussion. Thank you so much, Peter, for having us, for hosting this.
Thank you very much.
I think it's amazing that the Atlantic Council takes a step forward in the right direction and you know, generates this debate towards Cuba. And thank everyone for being here this morning. Thank you.